A realidade é ampla, surpreendente, misteriosa, mas, incrivelmente, ela é ao mesmo tempo apta de ser compreendida. Claro, nunca plenamente, mas cada vez mais profundamente. E apesar da realidade ser muito diversa em seus objetos, relações e mecanismos, ela apresenta sinais de ordem, de coerência e de unidade. E é fundado nessa visão que nós, da Academia ABC2, fundamos a revista Unus Mundus. Eu sou o Marcelo Cabral e tem sido uma grande alegria disponibilizar para o nosso público, para vocês, uma revista de alta cultura, não acadêmica, mas academicamente informada, que toca em vários dos temas fundamentais na intersecção da fé, das ciências e da filosofia, claro, com muitos ensaios, artigos, colunas, diversos meios de comunicação. E nós também temos este canal aqui, a Entre Mundos, onde nós convidamos grandes autores, grandes pensadores do mundo e do Brasil, para que a gente converse, né, sobre os temas que são do escopo do nosso jornal, que são do escopo da ABC2 e do escopo da Academia ABC2. Essas entrevistas que ficam sempre gravadas no YouTube, você pode ter acesso e mandar para os seus amigos, né? E lembrando, pessoal, que recentemente nós inauguramos um novo modelo de entrevista, como vai ser hoje, em que nós conversamos totalmente em inglês com o nosso convidado. A gente decidiu fazer assim para preservar a fluidez da conversa, para que as ideias possam serem ofertadas com mais qualidade, sem aquela interrupção da legenda simultânea. Mas, para vocês que estão ao vivo, lembrem-se que a gente vai legendar, isso quando for para o YouTube vai ter subtítulos aqui, legenda em português, para que todo mundo possa acompanhar a conversa e possa prestigiar e se deliciar com esse verdadeiro banquete intelectual que a Entre Mundos oferta. E hoje nós temos um convidado muito especial, que é o autor deste livraço aqui, Natureza Sanguinária, o professor Michael Murray, que daqui a pouco vai subir com a gente. Esse livro, pessoal, é parte da coleção Filosofia e Fé Cristã, uma parceria da ABC2 com o editor Ultimato, que tem lançado vários dos livros fundamentais aí na interseção de filosofia e fé cristã. E esse é um livro especial, livro em inglês publicado pela Oxford University Press, de alto calibre, de altíssimo nível, e que nós temos o privilégio de agora ter em português, com um trabalho editorial de altíssima qualidade, com uma tradução espetacular. Bom, gente, então agora eu vou convidar os nossos entrevistadores e o professor Murray para subirem aqui comigo. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Entre Mundos.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Então, a quick presentation. Professor Michael Murray é formado em filosofia pelo Franklin e Marshall College e possui mestrado e doutorado em filosofia pela importantíssima Universidade de Notre Dame. Ele é pesquisador sênior no Franklin e Marshall College e também atualmente é presidente do The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, que financia projetos educacionais e sociais pelo mundo. O professor Murray é autor de importantes artigos e livros em filosofia da religião, né? O livro chamado Filosofia da Religião, por Cambridge, e muitos outros, inclusive aquele que em inglês é chamado de Nature, Red in Tooth and Claw, que em português nós lançamos como Natureza Sanguinária. Aqui como entrevistadores nós temos Davi, que é doutorando em filosofia pela Unicamp e também pela Universidade de Missouri. O Davi, ele é líder de um projeto financiado pela John Templeton Foundation, que tem trazido aí diversos livros de filosofia da religião para o Brasil. O Davi é o grande responsável aqui, claro, uma equipe ampla, né? Mas é o grande responsável por a gente ter esse livro em português. O Gesiel possui graduação e mestrado em filosofia. Gente, desculpa, estou lendo aqui outra pessoa. O Gesiel é graduado em física e atualmente doutorando em filosofia pela Universidade de Missouri e pela Universidade Campinas. O Gesiel tem feito várias contribuições importantes aí para o diálogo da filosofia, da fé e das ciências. Atualmente foi um dos vencedores do projeto Radar ABC2 com seu manuscrito. E finalmente temos o Guilherme de Carvalho, o nosso querido capelão, pastor da Igreja Esperança, diretor do Labri Brasil, presidente da ABC2, e com certeza que o padrinho intelectual de muitos nós. E, pessoal, agora então está na minha hora de mudar para inglês para a gente começar a entrevista. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Davi, Gesiel, and Guilherme, and thank you very much, Dr. Murray, for accepting our invitation to be interviewed this night with us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so as the host, I will give me the privilege to ask the first two questions of our conversation. Dr. Murray, usually we start with a very philosophical question. The question is, who are you? I mean, tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey, your academic interests, and whatever else you think is interesting about yourself.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you this evening. So a little bit about my own background. I was born into a nominally Roman Catholic family, although we went to church very rarely. And I had a somewhat troubled family life growing up. My father was an alcoholic, and my parents got divorced when I was 9 years old. And as I progressed through my teenage years, we went through a lot of family struggles. And the problem of evil for me was very real. I was an intellectually serious kid, although I didn't get good grades in school, and I got into a lot of trouble. But I was an intellectually serious kid and thought about philosophical kinds of questions often. And watching what had happened within my own family, I got to the point where I simply couldn't believe in the existence of God any longer. It seemed to me that it was impossible that if there were an all-good God, that the sorts of things that happened to me could happen. And so by the time I was in the middle of my high school years, I was a pretty committed atheist, and would share that with other people. When there were families in my neighborhood who were devout Christians, and I was friends with kids in those families, and we would talk about these issues, and I would explain to them why I thought they were they shouldn't be taken seriously intellectually because of their religious belief. And as the year before I went to college, I worked together with a friend of mine who was a very serious Christian. And little did I know, he had taken on himself the task of explaining to me why I was incorrect. And we worked together for an entire summer. Every day we had a very boring job, doing some mechanical things, lots of time to talk. And every night we each went home and we read a lot and came back trying to convince the other one that we were right about things. And as we got to the end of that summer, I really began to feel not only intellectually that my own atheism was on shaky ground, but that the Holy Spirit was working on my heart. And at the beginning of the last year of high school, there was one evening when I called this fellow up on the phone and told him that I thought that I needed to ask Jesus into my heart as my Lord and Savior. And it was a transformative moment for me. When we saw each other the next day, he will tell you to this day, we're still very good friends, that he could tell on my face that I was a changed person. And after that point, I had never considered going to a Christian college because that wasn't any part of my heritage. I went to a secular institution and spent really all of my time outside of class reading philosophy. I'd intended to be a chemistry major. And that was all I did for the first 2 years, was study chemistry. And at the end of my sophomore year, my pastor said, you spend all of your time reading philosophical books. Don't you think that tells you something about your future and what you should be thinking about as a career? And I said, yeah, maybe you're right. And I went back and I canceled all my chemistry classes. I signed up for 4 philosophy classes and went on to major in that field. There was a professor at the college where I went as an undergraduate, which is Franklin and Marshall, where I went back later as a faculty member, who was a very vocal atheist. And he would challenge his students in class and tell them, if you have somebody that can come in and defend the existence of God, I'll let them come in and teach the whole class. They can take a whole class and teach the whole class. And my roommate took this class and asked me if I would go in and teach the class. And I went in to meet with him. and I said, I understand you're, pretty committed atheist, and that's what you teach in this class. And he said, it's my goal that every one of my students leaves my class an atheist. And I thought, well, if he can use the classroom as a platform for sort of talking about his atheistic beliefs, why couldn't someone who's a Christian philosopher come in and use the classroom as an opportunity to talk about why Christian beliefs should be taken seriously? And that was kind of the moment at which I decided I really wanted to go on to graduate school, and I wanted to come back and teach at a small school like the one that I went to, just to have the opportunity to share with students that they weren't getting the whole story. So I ended up going to Notre Dame, which at the time was probably the best place one could go for a philosophy PhD if you were a Christian. And then just really miraculously, they had a position in my area of expertise, which was 17th century European philosophy at that time. So I got hired back and was a colleague with my atheist former professor. And he never converted, but he did have me come and teach in his class every semester for the rest of his career. Yeah.
That's amazing.
So my areas of interest, in graduate school, I did my PhD on Leibniz. And so I was interested in, especially in the way in which medieval theological thought influenced early modern figures, which at the time was not a popular topic, although it's become one. And then later in my career, I became more interested in issues at the intersection of science and religion. The book on animal suffering was the first example of that. And then I went on to write a number of pieces and edit some volumes on evolutionary psychology and Christian faith.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Murray, for sharing with us. So I'm sure that our friends have very deep and cunning questions about your book, but I'd like to start with a very maybe broad question just to pave our discussion. So how would you frame in as few words as possible the problem of animal suffering? What is the problem of animal suffering?
So the problem of animal suffering is a challenge for Christian theism. It's a species of the broader problem of evil. And so, in general, we think that pain and suffering are bad states of affairs. And like any bad state of affairs, we think that's incompatible with the existence of an all-good creator unless there's some sufficient reason for it. So the question is there a sufficient reason that an all-good God could permit the existence of the kind of pain and suffering that we see in the non-human animal world, which is massive? Right? Non-human animals have been around for a very long time. There are a lot of them. And in many cases, their existence is filled with what appear to be a lot of pain and suffering. So if you're just looking at kind of units of pain and suffering across the history of the creation, non-human animal pain and suffering seems to significantly outweigh the amount of human pain and suffering. But most of the philosophical work on the problem of evil has been focused only on that, on human pain and suffering. So it seemed to me that this was a problem that hadn't really been taken seriously at the time that I wrote the book. So I wanted to address that and see what might a Christian say about how an all-good God could allow for the existence of this massive amount of suffering.
Terrific. Thank you for this very good summary. So I now invite Davi, please, to ask his first question.
Hi, thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, Dr. Murray. It's an honor to be here today. So my question is more to help our listeners to understand what's going on in the book. So here it is. I believe that in a sense, because the problem of animal pain and suffering is not adequately addressed by free will defenses or theodicies, it is a positively strong problem for theists. That's a difficult word for us, theists, that don't share Cartesian views of animals. Could you explain to our listeners this connection between free will responses to evil and the problem of animal pain and suffering?
Sure. So, when theists are challenged about why the universe or the creation contains pain and suffering, it's common for them to first point to the existence of free will as at least a partial explanation. And you can think of that explanation as coming in one of two sorts. On the one hand, we can look at evil that occurs as a result of immoral choices that are made by creatures like ourselves, right? We can choose to harm each other because God has given us the free will to do so. And when we do that, that comes as an exercise of our free will. We can choose to bring harm, physical or psychological harm, to other humans. We can cause harm to non-human animals as well. So the fact that God gave us that ability explains, at least, or could it be an explanation for at least some of the non-human animal suffering that we see. But there's a problem, of course, and that is that it looks like there's a lot of animal suffering around before any human beings come on the scene. But human beings come on the scene very, very recently. Perhaps 100,000 years ago, we get modern humans coming on the scene. But animals that are capable of feeling pain and suffering go back literally millions of years. So how do we explain that? Is there any kind of free will account that might explain that? And some have argued that the sin of an original human pair, Adam and Eve, might explain such suffering. But doing so is difficult, of course, because even if you take sort of more permissive views about when Adam and Eve existed, sort of the views that have been defended by, for example, William Lane Craig recently, it still doesn't push back the origin of human beings to so far back that it would explain the existence of all the non-human animal pain and suffering. There have been accounts by folks like William Dembski who claim that even though the sin of Adam and Eve come much later in the evolutionary trajectory, that their act of disobedience might have retroactive effects on the creation that would explain animal pain and suffering. But I don't find those accounts to be plausible. And so at a minimum, the question is, what explains the existence of all this animal pain and suffering that predates any creatures that have any kind of free will at all? Looks like you just can't explain it away by appealing to free will.
Very good. Thank you. And Gesiel, would you mind to ask your first question, please?
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Murray, it's a pleasure to be here. So I have a question that relates to skeptical theism and tries to compare the approach you develop in your book to that option of skeptical theism. Skeptical theists are those who endorse the view that we don't know the mixture of goods and evils. So we don't know. Maybe the fact that we do not know an answer to the problem of animal suffering is not a problem for theists in general, right? But in your book, you develop you say that we can provide some causa Dei explanations. That is showing how animal suffering benefits animals in some way, and that goes beyond traditional answers to the problem of natural evil, at least traditional in the context of analytic philosophy of religion. So what is the relevance of those forms of explanations? Why not stop our inquiry in skeptical theism as it provides an answer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I do wrestle with in the book. And I'll start off by first saying, as you know, and probably some of the listeners know, the position held by the skeptical theists is disputed by some. There are some who think that the skeptical theistic arguments are problematic. I don't. I actually think that the arguments that are offered by the skeptical theists probably are sufficient for pushing back against most of the more serious forms of the argument from evil for atheism. But I don't think that the Christians should simply stop there. Right? So it may be the case that given the complexity of creation, the finitude of our own minds, and the infinitude of the divine mind, that it would be impossible for us to try to determine what outweighing goods there are, and how those outweighing goods might serve to justify the existence of evils that we find around us. It would be an ultimate act of intellectual arrogance to assume that we would know enough of those things to be able to conclude that there's no God from the existence of evil. I mean, that's what the skeptical theists claim, and I think that's reasonable. But we shouldn't stop there, because even if that's true, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't want to go further, if possible, and show the critic, the atheist, the person who's really wrestling with these problems, that there might indeed be some explanation that's plausible. So the illustration that I give in the book of this is, if you go to the doctor and you need to get a shot you need to get your COVID vaccine or something, and the doctor goes to give you a shot and takes the sleeve off the needle and goes to put it up to your arm and drops it on the floor. And then the doctor reaches down and grabs it up off the floor, and he's ready to give you the injection again. And you say, whoa, wait a minute, that needle might have germs on it because you dropped it on the floor. And the doctor holds up the needle, says, I don't see any germs on there, and is get ready to give you the shot again, right? And you say, wait. Looking with your eyes, isn't a good reason to assume that there are no germs on there. That's the wrong instrument, right? And that's just bad. That's bad reasoning. And that's similar to what the skeptical theist is doing, right? The skeptical theist is saying to the atheist, you look at the existence of evil and you say, well, I don't see any reason for that could justify God in allowing that. And you say to them, well, look, that's an error in reasoning. You shouldn't expect to be able to see those reasons given your finite capacities. That's true.
Right.
But wouldn't it be better if you could say to the doctor, okay, here's a microscope. Look in the microscope. Do you see those germs on there? And the doctor says, yes, you're right. I see there are germs on there, right? And now I see that you're correct, that I shouldn't have formed that judgment.
I see.
In essence, what I'm asking is for Christians to do that, right? So let's roll up our sleeves and see, can we give the skeptic some reason to think that perhaps indeed there are sufficient reasons for an all-good God to allow that kind of suffering to occur? So don't just rest content with the skeptical theist response. Go one step further.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Very good. Very, very good. Thank you, Dr. Murray. Now I invite our chaplain, Guilherme, please, to ask his first question.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo. So, Dr. Murray, first of all, I was just remembering how was a meeting back in 2011, I think.
Yes.
In Rio de Janeiro. It was very important for this Brazilian Christian Association to come up, and I remember that I should thank you for the time for talking and suggestions, and then years later we could start it with all these new friends going ahead of me. But yeah, it was a great time. Thank you for that. But coming to my question, it's something related, very much related to the point of your book, but goes maybe a little further. So you deal a lot in the book with the problem of suffering in nature. And I have been concerned about the problem of competition in nature, which is part of the thing, the problem. But you can see that competition is something that it's more clearly opposed to compassion or cooperation, or maybe someone could argue that competition in nature is connected to cooperation anyway. But it's a moral issue also. But it's different from, of course, from the suffering problem. And I think about a ecological system in equilibrium. If you have that, you have a food chain, you have populations of different animals, and when they enter in a kind of balance, you need that balance to have life going, going on. And if you break that balance and you affect that competition in some way, you can have a break of the system. I have a friend that, not a friend, actually my brother worked with creation of reservations and protecting nature, working for a company. And he told me some time about this effort from big companies which work like, managing territories where there is a lot of animals, and maybe they must build a dam or do something that affects the populations, in some area, and they must to save all these animals and bring them to another place, try to save them. But then when they move these animals to another forest, they start a biological war, basically. And in the end, it's difficult to save these animals because you need the ecological balance to have a life thriving then. And when they raise up the number of some animals in some place, you have a biological war and many animals will die, and the numbers of the populations in the end will be the same. So this problem of competition is not like just a past question. It's necessary. It's part of our biological systems in our country, in our planet. I'm sorry, not just our country. But then I was thinking about competition and conflict among humans also, and think about all the study about human mating in evolutionary psychology. For example, we know that there is a element of competition, intersexual competition. I mean, males against males for females, and females with females against females for males. And you have also the intersexual competition when you have, for example, different needs and expectations from males and females. And that has some evolutionary basis for this conflict. We know that. And then it's part of the human love and relationship to have that conflict. And you could think like that, or maybe this is a effect of the fall. But from what we know about, primates and human anthropology, we know it can't be just that, And
Right.
so I think that it's similar. We have some kinds of competition which are related to suffering in nature and also in human nature, which it's difficult to connect to just the fall of man.
That's correct.
So that's my question. In theological or ethical terms, how can we relate it? Because you can have like a teaching about how we must be kind and we must love people and we must be to have compassion and everything, but we know that human economy and human sexual economy, but also our goods economy, is somewhat related to a dynamic that goes far away in natural history. And I think you are getting my thing. It's not exactly what you are dealing to. It's different from suffering. But I would like to hear you about that.
Sure. So let me give you a two-part response to that really interesting and insightful comment. There are many senses in which competition is part of the natural world and part of our evolutionary story. There's no doubt about that. But the first thing I want to say is the role of competition in the trajectory of biological evolution on Earth is overstated. And what I mean by that is that while on the one hand, there's those who adopt the Darwinian picture, or those on the outside who are considering the plausibility of the Darwinian picture, typically think about it as survival of the fittest. So there's some kind of competition for resources, and that competition for resources means that those who are most suited to take advantage of those resources will win, and those who can't take advantage of the resources will lose. And there is some truth to that. But in recent decades, evolutionary biologists have also shown that competition is really only half of the story. And that when we look at the trajectory of evolution over time, cooperation is just as important as competition. So, for example, when you look at what are called the major evolutionary transitions, these major transitions in the nature of life over evolutionary history, those major transitions are primarily characterized not by competition, but by cooperation. So, for example, The first major evolutionary transition takes place when we move from a world that consists of single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms. And these multicellular organisms function by giving up some of their individual autonomy as single-celled organisms in order to work collaboratively with other cells to make up an organism. You then move from these multicellular organisms to organisms that reproduce sexually, right? So sexual reproducers, unlike asexual reproducers, require cooperation from the other gendered side of their species in order to reproduce and produce future generations. And the amount of novelty you get into the gene pool from mixing genes in sexual reproduction is incredibly fertile for producing organisms that are well adapted to their future environment. We then move from sexual reproducers to sexual reproducers that live together in groups. And of course, group life is something that also requires a certain level of cooperation between individuals in that group in order to be able to take advantage of things like divisions of labor, right? So if we work together in a group, one person can be the farmer and one person can be the warrior, and right, and we divide up these duties. Each of us has to play our role, but in doing so, we end up having much more capacity to take advantage of the resources of our environment. This ladder of increasing complexity through evolutionary time is driven not by competition, but by cooperation. So I think that's something worth throwing into the conversation here so that we recognize it's not all a one-sided story. That said, competition is also a reality, and competition generally involves some kind of evil, suffering, pain, loss, predation, extinction, and death. And all of those are bad things. So again, you might ask, well, how can we explain those things in a world that's supposed to be, that the Christian claims is created by an all-good God? The full answer to that question is very complex and probably more complex than even I could articulate. But let me give you a simple start to the answer. If competition is primarily driven by seeking to take advantage of scarce resources, which it generally is, right? Think you gave the example of mating, right? So in the case of mating, males are competing for females in order to advance their reproductive aims, right? In order for them to be able to pass their genes on to the next generation. Okay, but how could we avoid these kinds of limitations? And the answer is, well, we can only avoid it if it turns out that there were infinite resources. But we can't live in an environment with infinite resources because we live on a finite planet. And for reasons of fine-tuning, we know that we couldn't live on an infinite planet, right? It would have to be infinitely large. The gravitational forces would be infinitely large, and organisms simply couldn't survive on a planet like that. So constraints of fine-tuning look like they require a finite environment, and a finite environment inevitably leads to some competition.
Yes. But I'm still uncomfortable with something, because I can see it, and I'm aware of Martin Novak's work on cooperation. Quite, aware about that work and other guys. So I'm comfortable with the idea that cooperation is an important principle for extended synthesis in evolutionary theory. So this is okay for me. But I'm still struggling with the problem of the competition. Is it intrinsically evil? That is my question. If you say, for example, that in human mating or animal mating, in general, you have cooperation among, between different sexes. This is different of the competition within a sex. So in that case, specifically, between the sexes, so you have the competition between male and female in human species, but in the sense that they have different risks and different needs. So they must find a way to cooperate, but each one must give up something. So there is a conflict there is tension, there is negotiation. It happens in the entire natural realm. And then I'm asking about competition, if we should treat it as intrinsically evil and a problem which we should deal philosophically, or, I mean, like that, or is it just something good that was corrupted in the case of the human experience? It would reflect in other aspects of life, like in sports, for example.
Sure.
Or maybe in a market economy.
Yeah.
But the roots are in nature, and it's very connected to animal suffering and human suffering also. So what do you think about competition?
Yeah, so it's a very big question, because the notion of competition is it's a capacious concept that applies in many different ways, right? So there's competition for nutritional resources, there's competition for reproductive resources, and it depends on whether you think these examples of competition means that there's inevitably a loser. So if there's inevitably a loser, then there is something intrinsically evil about it. If you think that there are cases of competition where there's not inevitably a loser, then there isn't. But within the context of evolutionary theory, there are some forms of competition where there has to be a loser. Because there are, for example, finite resources available for reproduction.
Yes.
Finite resources available for nutrition. And those organisms that can't compete for those resources end up dying or going extinct.
Yeah. See. Thank you.
So guys, it's a great discussion, of course. Giselle, now your time to ask your second question, please.
Like I said on the chat, I've got many more, so I have to be very specific.
To pick, maybe, yeah.
So one of the things that interests me especially is the fine-tuning argument. And it's always difficult to find a trade-off between fine-tuning and natural evil, at least in my case, so I think. So one of the most important arguments is that one of the design, or that design best explains the evidence of fine-tuning in the universe. But some claim that if there is natural evil, then the extent to which the evidence of fine-tuning confirms design can be diminished or even screened off. Do you think that natural evil, and specifically animal suffering, can affect or explain away fine-tuning to some extent? Any thoughts on that?
Well, explain away. Do you mean by that it's a defeater in some way, right? That it's counter evidence? Is that what you mean?
Maybe so. So in principle, we have design as an explanation to fine tuning, right? But given now the new evidence of animal suffering or even natural evil, broadly speaking, do you think that diminishes the extent to which the evidence of fine-tuning confirms design? Yeah.
So I don't think so, because for a couple of reasons. The one reason is, I think the theist or anyone has to ask themselves the question whether they think the existence of animal suffering, all things considered, counts as evidence against the existence of God in the first place. So if it doesn't count against the existence of God in the first place, then it doesn't count as evidence against the evidence for the existence of God we get from fine-tuning, right? That the evidence from fine-tuning gives you some positive reason to affirm it, and the evidence from the existence of animal suffering gives you no reason to disaffirm it, then it doesn't count against it. And I think that's the case. I think that I think that there are plausible explanations that the theist can offer for the existence of animal suffering in a world created by an all-good God, so that it doesn't undercut positive evidence for the existence of God. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, I think one other thing that has been underappreciated is that fine-tuning entails the existence of certain kinds of suffering. And the reason for that, as I mentioned, is because the constraints of fine-tuning seem to require that evolution takes place in the context of a finite environment. We cannot have evolution in the context of an infinite environment. It's physically impossible. And if that's true, then you're going to have, as an inevitable byproduct of a fine-tuned universe, the existence of some instances of natural evil. So natural evil can't count against it when it's entailed by it.
Oh,
great.
surprising and interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that point has been explored with sufficient care by Christians thinking about these issues.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Food for thought. And David, please, your next question.
Thank you. Dr. Murray, one theme you mention in your book is the possibility of eternal happiness in heaven for animals. I believe many theists have thought about this possibility in one moment or another. And how do you think the problem of animal pain and suffering contributes to the endorsement of this possibility? And what implications it might have for religious ethics and theology? Animals should have more rights in religious traditions. Animals may have souls or some soul type kind of endurance. Yeah.
That is a very big question.
Just say that it was my other question also, so I'm very interested on it.
Okay, so I can take twice as long to answer. So this is because this is responding to two different questions. So first of all, I think the question of whether or not non-human animals have a robust conscious life is still uncertain, right? And so whether they could have an eternal existence in which they in some way are able to enjoy and appreciate the presence of God, I don't know. But let's just assume that they can. Let's assume that that's a possibility. Then it seems to me, on the one hand, I mean, so as I mentioned in the book, there are some people who think that the possible sort of conscious enjoyment that animals would enjoy in an afterlife, in some way, provides justification for, compensation for suffering that animals might incur during their earthly life. I don't think that's correct for reasons I say in the book, because even if somehow this eternal life provides them with some sort of compensation, you still have to explain why it was justified for God to permit their suffering in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. What permitted that suffering? This may be the compensation that you get later, but if there's no reason to permit the suffering in the first place, then there would be no reason to provide this compensation either. So I don't think the existence of animals in some kind of heavenly state is sufficient to explain away the problem of animal suffering. You still need something more. But you had another element to this question, which is, if we assume that animals have some kind of existence in a future heavenly state, does that change the obligations that we should think human beings have towards non-human animals? And I think the answer to that question is also no. I think whatever obligations we have towards non-human animals depends on the kinds of creatures that they are. If they're capable of experiencing pain and suffering, we do have obligations towards them. And what obligations do we have? Well, same obligations we have towards each other, not to cause unnecessary or unjustified or unwarranted pain and suffering. So causing animals unwarranted pain and suffering is immoral and something that Christians should oppose. Of course, then it's an open question. Well, what would be the justifying conditions? Under what conditions are we permitted to cause animals pain and suffering? Are we permitted to eat them, for example? Right? Are we permitted to kill them to provide human nutrition? I think on the one hand, as a Christian, you say, well, look, it looks like the answer is yes, because it's something that God permitted in the pages of Scripture itself, right? So if we're asking from the perspective, from the Christian's perspective, is that permissible? I think you have to say yes. Now, some might think that provides an argument against the existence of God because they think animals have certain rights that don't permit that. I don't think that's true. But I think whether those animals have post-mortem existence, they have we have certain obligations towards them, and those obligations don't change.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Very, very, very interesting fact. Thank you. Now, Guilherme would like to ask another question.
Yes.
So please.
A question. I want to comment this part of your argument that you you speak about the need of pain to survive, actually, and how important is the pain feeling for any organism to relate to its environment and to protect itself. And it must be a real feeling and not just a mechanical, like a robotic answer to challenges. And it was so amazing to read that as like pain as a kind of gift. It's absolutely entangled with other aspects of organic life, and you cannot just take it away from finite beings which are corporeal. And I must to say, I was moved to tears at some points of the argument, just because I had some insights around it, but I had never read something so clear about the importance of feeling pain, to be totally connected to your environment and to survive. But anyway. My point is that have you how has been your experience explaining it? Because I mean, for any person suffering pain, it sounds really like thin, or maybe it could sound even disrespectful. But then when I think about the logic of it, it makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that I cannot ignore the fact that my pleasures and my good experiences are entangled with the capacity to feel pain. I cannot separate them. Maybe I should find a philosophical account for it, but even if I don't have, I can see that you cannot separate it. So then we should be trained maybe to think differently about pain. I'm really thinking about that, how to teach about it in church even. But how has it been for you to discuss it? How do people react?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'll give you a two-part answer. As those of you who've read the book know, in chapter 2, I do entertain the Cartesian response to the problem of suffering. On the Cartesian response, non-human animals don't experience any kind of phenomenally conscious pain. That's what people usually want to talk to me about when we talk about this book. But I'm very glad we haven't talked about that, because I think there are lots of more interesting things to talk about in the book than that. But anyway, in that chapter, what I do say is that it's certainly possible to have a world filled with organic creatures that can withdraw from dangerous stimuli, what scientists call noxious stimuli, a stimulus that's likely to cause damage to your body, without actually having any pain feeling, right? Your body can be set up in such a way that when you step on a tack or a nail, your limb withdraws from that because your body detects an actual or potential injury. And it could be that all the behaviors that we see displayed by non-human animals are simply those kinds of reactions to dangerous stimuli that aren't based on having any kind of internal feeling. That's a possibility. Do I think that's the way it actually is? I don't actually. And so then the question after you get past that chapter in my book is, okay, well, how do you explain how a good God can permit pain and suffering if the Cartesian answer is incorrect? So in chapter 3, I explore this possibility that you're referring to now, that we should think of pain differently, right? That pain isn't just a bad thing. It's a necessary byproduct when you have two conditions. Number one, creatures with bodies, because those bodies can be injured by other physical objects. And number two, creatures that act on intentions. So you have a goal in mind. There's some goal that you want to achieve. When those two conditions are met, you probably need to have pain as a way of preventing you from causing yourself injury when you're trying too hard to achieve your goal, right? When you try too hard to achieve your goal, you might do things that cause your body physical injury might even cause your physical death, unless there's some counterweight, there's some balance, right, in your psychological profile that says, stop doing this, you're injuring yourself, right? And what we know from research that's been done on human beings, at least, that don't have pain sensation is that other signals, there are other ways of signaling that your body is subject to a noxious stimulus. You can put on pressure-sensitive gloves, and when pressure is applied, you can see a light or hear a sound. But seeing lights and hearing sounds don't actually get you to stop doing the thing that you shouldn't do when you want to achieve the goal, right? It looks like pain is the only thing that, for intentional agents, provides you with the counterweight that you need to achieving these intentional goals when you're putting your body at risk. So it's a pretty fascinating hypothesis. And I agree with you that once you begin to see pain in that light as a gift to embodied organisms, as a way of ensuring that they don't harm themselves, then you look at it differently. Now, having said that, when I make this comment to atheists, they'll say, okay, fine, we agree that in some cases, pain is necessary in order to prevent embodied organisms from causing themselves physical injury or death.
Yeah.
But there's lots of pain that doesn't serve that function, right? And so how do you explain the fact that there's a lot of pain that still doesn't fit under that explanatory rubric? I can go further if you want, but I mean, so there is that further question to answer. Why does pain sometimes misfire?
It's a good question. I don't know if Marcelo is going to allow us to listen to you, but
well, I know. Yes, I want to stop there if there are other questions.
I think you can, like, if you would like to complete or give your thoughts on that, we can listen to you, please.
Sure. So, some philosophers have argued that, in fact, there is no misfired pain in non-human animals. That anytime that non-human animals only experience pain when there's actually a noxious stimulus that might cause them physical injury or death. Do we know that that's not true? No, we don't know that it's not true. But we know that it's not true for us. Right? We experience pain that doesn't seem to have that kind of utility, right, or value. So what might explain that? And what might explain it is, and this goes on to the next chapter of the book, that it's, number one, a good thing for God to have created a universe that operates according to uniform natural laws, right? And that sometimes a universe that operates according to universal natural laws has byproducts that are suboptimal. So in a universe governed by these natural laws where God isn't constantly intervening to prevent the negative consequences, there are sometimes earthquakes, and there are sometimes hurricanes, and there are sometimes thunderstorms, and there are sometimes pains that don't have utility.
Yeah.
And, the critic might say, well, couldn't God have designed a world with less of those unfortunate byproducts? And the answer is, we don't know. Designing a universe is a really complicated thing.
Yeah.
It is.
None of us has ever done it.
Yeah, exactly.
Good point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, guys, we have time for one final question. Giselle or Davi would like to ask one last question, please.
Davi, would you like to ask the last? Because
Giselle is wanting very much.
I have just one more, and it's not very interesting. So go on.
Okay, humble guy.
I was going to.
Giselle, please.
So my question would be more general. So Davi, if you would like to talk specifically more about the book, no. So I was gonna just ask Michael Murray as an experienced philosopher. Sometimes philosophy can be a lonely activity. We as philosophers, we have a young but vibrant community of analytic philosophers of religion in Brazil, and I would like to know. What is the relevance of being part of an intellectual community, and how can one become a better philosopher by just engaging in intellectual activity together with others? I mean, Could you give any advice to this regard?
I think it's a really good question, and the way in which the community of Christian scholars and Christian philosophers has evolved over the last 50 years has been pretty remarkable. Most of you guys aren't old enough to remember that as late as the early 1970s, there really were no Christian philosophers. I mean, the idea of Christian scholarship finding a place in the major academic presses and journals just didn't really exist. And then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, like, this community really blossomed and flourished. And part of the reason it did that is because some of the senior leaders who were advancing this movement really took the time to create that community. They took the time to build these academic societies and these academic journals, and took time from their very busy schedules to attend in-person conferences where they could mentor the next generation. That's still an important part of I think, our obligation as Christian scholars to support each other. But what we have now is even a much greater opportunity, because we can network with each other in the way we are now, virtually. And so there's so much more of an opportunity for Christian scholars to interact with each other, to support each other through social media, through opportunities like this. And I think it's incredibly important, especially for those more senior scholars, to make sure that they're taking the time to help those who are more junior to advance through their careers, understand how the academic world works, and to just share with them the knowledge and experience that they've gained as Christians who have become more theologically and philosophically informed and astute. I think, finally, I think it's also important for each cohort of Christian scholars, as they move through, to generate these relationships with each other and to sustain them and to support each other in their work. What I've seen over the course of my career is that has been so critical, not just to the flourishing of the Christian academic community, but to the maturity of Christian scholarship, right? That allows us to be the intellectual engine for the kingdom of God.
It's perfect.
What amazing.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Inspirational. Thank you.
So yes, very inspirational. So thank you guys very, very much for your time. Thank you, Davi, Gesiel, and Guilherme, for great questions, very insightful, engaging with the book, proposing new ways of thinking about this stuff. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for Dr. Murray for sharing his time, his intelligence, his ideas with us. Thank you very much, guys. I'm quite sure that our audience enjoyed very much.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the really insightful questions about the book. I appreciate it, and I appreciate having the time to talk with you.